Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, your moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap with some really interesting information, but before we get started with that, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you'll be able to access it on demand. Following the event, we will be sending out an email that will contain a link to the webinar that you can access on demand. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar.
Thank you, Charlene. As stated, my name is Wayne Ariola, and I'm with a company called Tricentis. And the bulk of what I'm going to present to you today was the result of a 9-month research project that we did jointly with Forrester, and we did it around the idea of what makes a DevOps leader and what makes a DevOps laggard. And I think what we're going to present to you today is going to be pretty interesting, and I think it is groundbreaking research as it comes to the intersection of testing or continuous testing and DevOps. So first of all, just to introduce myself. I've been in the software testing space for a number of years, I think about 16 now. I've authored a couple of books and contributed to many books, but the most recent one was Continuous Testing for IT Leaders. I have patents in the space, and the transition to continuous testing is obviously, I think, just an imperative part of DevOps success. So it's an exciting time to be here. If you'd like to link up with me on LinkedIn or tweet, those are how you can get a hold of me today, and we'll revisit that at the end of the presentation. But let me just go through the agenda. Today, what we're going to do is talk about digital transformation and the implications. I'm going to introduce briefly what is continuous testing, because there seems to be some discussion around that. Talk about good versus bad continuous testing practices and metrics, and then talk about the 5 core continuous testing recommendations, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A. Hopefully we'll get this all done in 40 to 45 minutes so we can get on with our day. But first of all, I really do appreciate you joining me for this webinar. The first thing I want to start with is digital transformation. And I think this is a term that I think everyone has heard, and I think it's being talked about more and more and more. But I think the interesting thing here is digital transformation is now a boardroom issue. And, you know, you might think, well, haven't we been digitally transforming all the time? Haven't we always been, doing something with software, improving software, or trying to digitally transform our organizations? The answer is yes. But I think digital transformation from the perspective of being a boardroom topic today is much, much different than the question that we were answering before. Before we were talking about process and process efficiency type questions. Today, digital transformation is about really the visceral components of the business and how can that business survive in turmoil. And what I mean by turmoil is that every segment and every organization today who's out there who trades something, whether it's money or trades something with consumers or businesses for a product or service is under pressure. And that pressure is this disruption that can be delivered by the connection of software to the individual. And it is amazing on what the numbers show. IDC says that basically 40% of all technology spending will go towards digital transformation initiatives, which is going to equate to about $2 trillion to spend by 2019, which is quite amazing. But, the type of digital transformation we're talking about is really connecting with the consumer and making sure that your customer has the connection with your organization in order for them to be thrilled. And although this has been the customer-centric economy has been the topic of many boardroom topics over the years, today it is about the future of the business. Can an organization sustain itself without this really core connection with its user over software or through a mobile device, giving them the ability to connect and remain connected all the time? But it really comes down to, what does digital transformation require? And digital transformation requires many things, but we know it requires the ability to be responsible. It requires confidence to move forward. It requires the agility in order for you to meet the demands and the shifting expectations of your end user. And it really does require trust at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, an individual or an organization or a person, your customer, is connecting with you. And I know today trust is equated a lot with security, and that's certainly part of it, but trust goes beyond it. Who is your relationship going to be in the certain segments of software and or business services that you consume? And that goes from banking. Choosing your bank and your primary bank is a very critical conversation today, as you will spend a lot of time in their interface and trusting that interface. Spending time with your music provider. I know that's a big decision for me, and a decision that's constantly being jogged by other opportunities within the market itself. So what it does require at the end of the day is continuous testing. And let me actually start with the definition of continuous testing, because this comes right from Wikipedia. Continuous testing is the process of executing automated tests as part of a software delivery pipeline in order to obtain feedback on the business risks associated with the software release as rapidly as possible. And I think this is a pretty good definition. And you could say, well, how is it different? I think it's different for two reasons. One, software testing has always been about trying to understand if there's bugs versus the requirements. And we did testing in very broad strokes. Testing today and continuous testing needs to be about the right feedback at the right time for the right stakeholder. And I'm going to add to this one more point, which is actionable. So our goal as testers is to give the right feedback at the right time to the right state for the right stakeholder that's actionable, meaning that we've produced a lot of tests, and those tests have produced a lot of results, and those results become negotiated over time rather than actionable because of the phase of the project that it's in. And this needs to really be re-looked at or reinvestigated as ideas such as scaled agile, as DevOps initiatives start to infiltrate our organizations. The second thing that I need to emphasize here about continuous testing is that continuous testing can happen anytime in the service delivery lifecycle, right? Anytime in your software delivery lifecycle. It isn't about shift right. It isn't about continuous testing. It isn't about shift left. It isn't about any point in time. It's about all points in time, as long as we can deliver the right feedback at the right time, which is actionable for the right stakeholder. And that's the one thing we have to realize, that our scope of what we're going to be responsible for as testers is going to expand significantly. So let me just look at a few things here and primarily look at testing in transition and talk about what's going on with the organization in regards to testing. So first of all, let's look at system architectures. System architectures obviously started out very centralized, and now they've become highly decentralized with cloud native, with microservices, with applications now that are extraordinarily more componentized and malleable. So system architectures today are trending towards really decentralization. With that, let's look at the dev team structures. Dev team structures came from, very structured waterfall type processes. And now we've gone through a peak of agile and scaled agile. So our dev team structure has certainly gone through this idea of being highly centralized and highly waterfall to being broken apart into really more agile-based teams. And now we're looking at things that are even more matrix, like tribes. So the dev team structure has certainly gone decentralized. But then let's look what happened to the actual test team structure. The test team structure has lagged behind the dev team structure, and there's a couple reasons for it. First, in a waterfall process, the test team remained in the traditional waterfall type structure. Then it merged to a kind of a shared service center of excellence that actually did not necessarily get us farther down the path of decentralization. It still remained very centralized. And then finally, we kind of broke apart, and this idea of merging dev test together in a shift left motion has actually merged the testers more into a more decentralized type of form today. Even though the center of excellence is still a concept, the idea of moving towards or paralleling the dev team structure is obviously more popular today than it has ever been in the past. And why am I mentioning this? Well, I'm mentioning this is that this is the one point in history where we really have a distinct opportunity to discuss and stay in pace with development associated with software testing. That's number one. Number two, the one thing that we really need to watch out for here as testers is that we don't compartmentalize ourselves to just the activity of development in order to execute tests. Meaning the more myopic type activities that happen during code change time, which are more progressive type testing, cannot necessarily deter us from broader end-to-end regression type testing, which our tendency now is to actually, during the shift left motion, is to actually compartmentalize tests into smaller pieces, which is okay, but we can't lose that end-to-end vision. So that's the first challenge. The good thing about testing in transition is that we are now paralleling the more dev team process or structure. The bad thing about testing in transition is that we are now going to be facing new challenges as the end-to-end transaction becomes much, much more of a focus of the testing activity. What else is going on? Well, in 2018 and 2019, we're also seeing testing as a percentage of IT application budget increasing, okay? Now, this is unfortunate. This is unfortunate because it becomes much, much more of a focal point. And why have we seen these costs incur over the last 2 years? And I think the answer is quite simple, is that we are seeing an influx of insourced test projects, meaning that software testing used to be more of an activity associated with just the project itself, or it could have been an outsourced business process. And during that outsourced business process, you would actually take on the whole activity offshore. But now we see those projects coming back onshore, and the predominant type of practice that is going on when it comes back onshore is manual testing, which is actually increasing or raising the level of cost of actual software testing. So we have a challenge in front of us. And this challenge in front of us is to get out of this debt that is associated with manual testing and get to better, more resilient test automation. Okay. And this is a good slide that comes from the State of DevOps report that shows the J curve associated with the struggles associated with adopting test automation. The first thing that happens with test automation is essentially that teams begin to transform quite quickly. You'll get a couple really good wins. And automation helps projects actually move forward quite well in the beginning. But then what happens is automation increases the testing requirements, because now you're actually trying to not only keep up with the new requirements coming in, but you're also trying to expand or maintain the tests that were already constructed. And this is where you face, or an organization faces with test automation, the biggest rate of abandonment. And this is the bottom of the curve. So you've basically bottomed out here. From that, we find that technical debt usually mounts, and then we find a lot of blockage associated with moving the process forward. And it's only a relentless commitment to improving the software testing process that gets people through here. And this is one of the major findings associated with our report, and this J curve shows it quite well, is that organizations who highly commit to evolving or transforming software testing as part of their process are the people who get through this J curve. And it's a commitment top down. I'm going to show you some data on that coming up in the presentation. So with that groundwork being laid out, let me talk to you a little bit about the report we produced. So this is the Forrester Research report. It's called the Definitive Software Quality Metrics for Agile and DevOps. Not a very creative title, but nonetheless, it's very direct. We're telling you exactly what's in here. Here are the software quality metrics for Agile and DevOps. So let me tell you the secret here. The secret inside this report is that these are the metrics that differentiate someone who is a leader from someone who is a laggard. Okay. And the interesting thing that we expose in this, and I'll go through this in this presentation, is that there are 5 core continuous testing practices that separate successful DevOps leaders from laggards. Business risk must be accurately and continuously managed. Leaders ruthlessly drive end-to-end automation. And then at the end of the report, you'll see that there's the top 20 definitive quality metrics measured by the leaders. And I'm going to go through some of the characteristics of those metrics in this presentation. If you would like to grab this report right now, you can go to this URL above, innovate.tricentis.com/Forrester-DevOps. We'll also send this out to you for participating in this webinar. You will be able to get access to it as well. But if you'd like it now, this report is fully available online as I speak. So first finding, what differentiates a DevOps leader versus a DevOps laggard? And the first thing is there's 5 core continuous testing practices that are followed versus the laggard who relies primarily on manual testing. That seems pretty obvious, but once I go through the 5 core continuous testing practices, this will make more sense. Here's something that was extraordinarily interesting. The leaders are twice as likely to consider automating the software quality process as a critical business differentiator. And I was alluding to this a couple slides back, meaning that there's a commitment to transformation, which makes this a totally different process. Whereas the laggards are twice as likely to report that testing is a bottleneck, meaning that they haven't fought through the bottom of that J-curve and they're building technical debt. Leaders focus on contextual metrics that give an indication of things like risk or requirements coverage, whereas laggards are more likely to focus on counting metrics like number of tests or summary metrics, which don't necessarily give you any context about the state of the application or the readiness of that application for release. So for DevOps leaders, we need to measure, they also measure the user experience across an end-to-end transaction. Okay, this is pretty interesting. Whereas laggards also primarily measure application-specific or team-specific metrics. Now, this is actually one of the biggest and most major differences, and it's critical to look at, only because if you look at what the leaders have done, is even though Agile has broken apart different teams into smaller teams that are joined primarily with like a dev test liaison, they're still taking the time to look at the end-to-end transaction as the primary measure of quality, rather than looking at more myopic-based processes or application-specific type of tests. And this is critical, meaning at times, especially when you're in a agile environment and you're under pressure with the sprint, there is the tendency to just check off that the use case is validated and tested. Whereas we all know that that use case probably has a broader life in a broader end-to-end transaction. So that being said, the difference between leaders and laggards is pretty interesting, where the end-to-end transaction is the focus of the testing exercise versus something that's more boxed into an application. So let me break apart some of those findings and get into the first finding, which were 5 core continuous testing practices. And this is the most significant differentiator. They implement continuous testing to meet the demands of release frequency. So release frequency is the driver of the automation and the driver of the continuous testing practices. Number 2, and we mentioned this at the last part of the last slide, which is they automate end-to-end functional testing. Okay, so this means that the automation isn't necessarily just around the UI for a specific part or component of an application. It is the end-to-end transaction that's actually automated. So the full customer experience, whether they're going in through a mobile app or a browser, through maybe a service layer into a back-end transaction and back out, that entire path is executed in a regression type test, which is automated, and that's pretty critical. Next, they do shift testing left earlier into the development lifecycle, but this shift left is complemented by number 2 there, which is the automated end-to-end functional testing. 4, they include testers as part of their integrated delivery team, not just test and not just dev test, but part of the integrated planning in the team. And finally, they allocate proper testing budgets and focus on upgrading their testing skills. Okay, this was a pretty incredible finding. I think for year after year, we found that new IT initiatives or new development initiatives got allocated budget for training and skill enhancement, whereas the testers were usually or traditionally left behind. I know in many agile training scenarios that the testers were usually the last group to actually get the testing, or excuse me, get the training. So with that being said, the idea that testing budget and the focus on skill upgrade is a requirement in order to achieve the demands of DevOps. So let's go through some of the findings from the report itself. And the first one is advanced testing practices here. So what you see here in the report is basically the difference between the leaders, which are in blue on top, or the top light blue bar, versus the others, or the laggards, who are not necessarily considered higher performers in their peer group. So the key here is that both advanced techniques, an array of advanced techniques, are used to differentiate a leader versus a laggard, meaning that not only do the leaders use more technology, but they also use it more consistently, which doesn't seem like too big of a finding. But look at the differences in some of the deltas here, and let me point out a couple. First of all, test data management. And the test data management feature here in terms of the gap between the leaders and the laggards, which 41% of the leaders are essentially using test data management capabilities, whereas only 24% of the laggards are using test data management capabilities, is really in line with this idea of manual versus automated testing as well, meaning that the more advanced organizations are using test automation, and within that comes the need for better test data management. Another couple interesting facts: test-driven development is used, and the gap is 36% between the leaders versus 19% with the laggards. And another one I like is CI. It seems like we've been talking about continuous integration for a long, long time. But the interesting part here is there's a distinct gap, 15% gap, between the leaders. 35% of them are actually using or leveraging continuous integration versus laggards, which is only at 20%. And also, to talk to code coverage analysis, 31% of leaders are using code coverage analysis. I think this is telling, because code coverage analysis assists you to get at some more contextual type metrics. So that is a finding that was well in line with this idea that leaders use better contextual-based practices or contextual-based metrics versus laggards who use basic counting metrics. Let's look at automation itself. So this actually, the question that we asked here is, using your best estimate, how much do you automate each of the following? And, basically over 50% automated was kind of the key here to get at. Not only the use of certain testing practices, but also the automation of those practices differentiated the leaders from the laggards here. And if you look at it, the acceptance testing was certainly one that was the biggest gap. It was 61% versus 34%. Another couple interesting items here are to look at is the test data management piece. And really, which I thought was interesting, is the API testing. With API testing, the leaders were really at a 58% likelihood of having advanced automation, which as laggards were only at about 37%. And this is a pretty significant finding because in order for you to actually get to advanced levels of test automation, we got to pull away from the actual GUI-based practices into the underlying API. And that's going to give us a lot more confidence associated with the risk of the application itself. Just to move on here, another finding is around automation and making it a critical part of the actual organization's objectives themselves. So the question we asked here is, compared to other IT processes in your organization, rate the importance of automating your software quality process. And you can see here between the people in dark blue who follow the best practices is that they were significantly more likely to consider it as a business differentiator, meaning that the priority associated with achieving the automation was aligned with actual business success. Rather than not important at all, or showing it somewhat important, or it was a strategic priority. The leaders really had this outstripped, where they considered it as a true business differentiator. And with it, they put in the time, the effort, and the skills upgrade in order to achieve the business goal of automating software testing. This is a pretty critical finding, and this also, basically tells the story of the J curve that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Whereas organizations who have not declared automation as a critical initiative basically fall into that valley, or fall into that area where you go into the valley of despair associated with automation and traditionally abandon the project. So next, and I think this was pretty interesting, what this slide shows you is on the left, you show the question about how do CXOs estimate their level of DevOps and continuous testing maturity. So on the left, what you're going to see is these are the metrics for DevOps, and on the right, these are these metrics for continuous testing. So when we ask CXOs, how do they rate their processes? CXOs overwhelmingly estimate their capability. So let's look at this and dissect it just slightly here. So on the left, which talks about DevOps, CXOs, 44% of CXOs said that they were far ahead, whereas the non-CXOs, did not rate their ability to achieve the goal quite as high. So the majority of the non-CXOs said that they were slightly ahead or on par. So there is an over-exuberance of your CXO or your CIO, your CTO, your senior leaders to say that there is maturity associated with some of these practices. Now, it was really interesting in continuous testing, where you had the 44 versus 14%, where the CXOs thought that they were far ahead in their testing journey. And then if you looked at the majority for the non-CXOs, it was either on par or slightly ahead, which is an interesting finding. And this is actually followed on by the organization's total maturity too. CXOs said that they followed best practices to the tune of 57%, whereas non-CXOs said they followed best practices to the tune of 26%. So basically, if you ask the CXO if the organization followed best practices, 57% of the CXOs would say yes, whereas only 26% of the practitioners or non-CXOs would answer yes. So when it comes to the understanding of the concept versus practice, there's a huge delta here. And so why am I pointing this out? I'm pointing this out for really one reason. When it comes down to budget time, when it comes down to training, when it comes down to increasing the ability of an individual's soft skills or process enhancement type initiatives, CXOs are overestimating the organization's ability to achieve these goals. When the CXO is overestimating the ability for the organization to achieve the business process goals and there is budget requests, they are going to ask more questions and try to understand why. And with their predisposition that everything's okay, this is where the budgetary challenges comes in. So my advice here is to be upfront and to understand where your next step process improvements need to be, and not just report on test automation outcomes, but report on the test automation evolution itself. And I think this is something that isn't necessarily executed as just the results, summary results of tests, and automated tests are shared with senior leaders. So really, I have three core recommendations for you. And again, I encourage you to read this paper in more detail. There are significantly more details in there, inclusive of an overview of the top 20 metrics, as well as a lot more charts like this that show and present more detail around the idea of what makes a leader versus a laggard. But my key recommendations are make business risk the driver for your metrics program, meaning that communicate in a business language that allows the business leaders, not necessarily the technical leaders, to understand the state of the application or the state of the release candidate as you are ready to release, and make business risk the driver for that conversation. 2, ruthlessly automate. And what this also means is if your organization is one that does not necessarily declare that automation is a critical business success factor, start making the change. Start helping the organization understand why that test automation is required to achieve the speed and the agility objectives associated with scaled agile and DevOps. And then finally, prioritize test execution predicated around business risk. Now, this is kind of a loaded recommendation because there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to actually do this. There's a lot of great automated tools out there that assist in risk prioritization and the establishment of test cases and test case design predicated on a risk profile. And those tools have been maturing over the years, and they're fantastic. The capability for you to leverage these risk-based tools is really a reality today. So I would investigate that. Tricentis happens to be one that does that, but I only mention that because prioritize test execution predicated around business risk. So finally, there's a couple questions that have come in, and I'd like to address those. Again, here's the URL to actually get the report itself. So if you would like to pick up the report, please go to this URL. So first question that came in, actually there's a number of questions that came in, but let me take the top 3 here. Just in case here. So as a metric, what's wrong with focusing on the number of tests? And so there isn't anything wrong about focusing on the number of tests, and the number of tests is an interesting metric. But the number of tests does not give you any information or contextual information about the application itself or the state of the application itself. It just tells you about the number of tests. So if I have one application that has 10 tests and another application that has 100 tests, are you going to assume that the application with 100 tests is tested better or more accurately? You just don't know. It doesn't give you any contextual information associated with the state of the application. The key here is that over the years, we've defaulted to the idea that the count of tests matter, and it was a measure of our productivity, showing that, hey, we've built 5,000 test cases, aren't we great? And the reality is it doesn't matter. The other reality is that the count of test cases, especially if you use it as a metric, becomes actually a problem as more and more test cases are entered into the regression suite, it becomes more and more to maintain. You're going to increase your level of false positives if that's what you're trying to incent. And then what's going to also happen is you're going to get test suite bloat here. And so using the count of tests as one of your primary metrics, I would try to avoid it. Automated continuous testing aside, isn't exploratory testing also valuable for the user experience? Yeah, so in terms of continuous testing, so continuous testing itself is about giving the right feedback at the right time to the right stakeholder, which is actionable. And you know, from a perspective of automated or not automated, there's certainly parts of the process that automation makes total sense, right? And then there's other parts of the process that practices like exploratory testing are amazingly valuable, meaning getting the user experience input into the changing application up front if you're doing a big UI lift is a great thing to use exploratory testing for. Mobile design and application development is a great thing to use exploratory testing for early. And with exploratory testing, the techniques and automation that have been recently released around exploratory testing make it a significantly more beneficial activity to the tune that automated tests can actually be derived from the exploratory testing sessions. So I would say that, one, given the question, exploratory testing is extraordinarily valuable for the user experience type testing. And two, that you know, you shouldn't consider exploratory testing anything different or a tool that isn't part of your continuous testing journey. It should certainly be part of it. Then the last question here to address is, should we shift right instead of left? Okay, that's an interesting question as well. So, you know, the definition of continuous testing, again, is getting that right feedback. Whether you shift left or whether you shift right, it's not going to matter as long as you're able to give the right feedback to the right stakeholder at the right time, which is actionable. Okay. And I know that seems like a cop-out, but when you look at the shift left activities, those are certainly going to be there to assist you from a defect prevention perspective, to help you solidify the changing code base and understand what the impacts are to the use case themselves. However, when you get to the middle or you start shifting right, you're going to find that you're going to get much, much better, more comprehensive user experience type tests that give you the ability to test more end-to-end based transactions because more of the application is complete. You know, if you are considering techniques that are, you know, more on the left, which, you know, like TDD or BDD or expanding your unit testing capabilities, or you're looking at things that are more on the right, which can be more type of capabilities that use or leverage automation, leverage more kind of AIs in terms of visual AI to do kind of visual testing or techniques like that. It just really matters about A, the application, B, the architecture of that application, and C, the importance of the user experience associated with that release candidate. So again, it's all about risk. And I would encourage a really balanced distribution of practices predicated on any application itself. So guys, I think I've gone my time. It's about 40 minutes in. I apologize for the audio glitch. I hope we're able to potentially edit it out, but nonetheless, it's probably going to be in there. With that, I want to thank you for joining me for these 40 minutes. And if you do have any questions that I did not answer and you're curious about, please don't hesitate to email me. A last pitch for the actual paper itself. You can download the paper right now. It's live and it's highly detailed, giving you a lot of detail on what are the testing practices that differentiate DevOps leaders from DevOps laggards. Again, thank you so much. Thanks to DevOps.com, and we look forward to seeing you on another webinar.
All right, great webinar. Lots of great, interesting information. So I did want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or you just want to listen to it again, just know that you'll be able to do so on demand. We will be sending out an email that will contain a link to the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always check there. And then while you're there, you can check out the other webinars that we have both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be one or more that pique your interest. For now, though, I'd like to thank you for joining me today, and thanks to our esteemed panelists for joining me. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.